Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. Today is the second year anniversary of the passage of the Fostering Connections Act. We're really pleased to mark this day with a wonderful program focused on state implementation efforts.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. Today is the second year anniversary of the passage of the Fostering Connections Act. We're so pleased to mark this day with a wonderful program focused on state implementation efforts aimed at improving outcomes for older youth in foster care. Thank you to partner organizations of the Fostering Connections Resource Center for helping to organize and host today's program. These include the National Conference of State Legislatures, the Finance Project, Foster Club, the John Burton Foundation, and Fostering Media Connections. There are nearly 400 individuals signed on to the webinar from states across the country, so we know there's a great deal of interest in this topic. On the screen, you will see the names of invited guests who will speak about their role in advancing implementation. We'll make introductions shortly, but first we'll take a look at the agenda for the next 90 minutes. So we have a very full agenda. The substantive discussion will be broken into 3 sections, similar to panel discussions. There will be questions and answers following each panel discussion. Before we begin those discussions, we'll provide a quick overview of the webinar's technology so that you can easily follow the program and submit questions at any point. We will also briefly touch on the legislative history of the Fostering Connections Act. The first panel discussion will be led by state experts who will discuss legislative efforts to extend care to children beyond age 18. The discussion will also focus on the fiscal analysis that accompanies state legislation, as well as the role of stakeholders. The second panel discussion will feature new transition planning toolkits. One was developed by former foster youth for use by their peers. The second are companion tools that are developed to engage community leaders to support the transition of young people from foster care. Finally, the third panel will showcase a new initiative focused on engaging media and elevating public awareness about the Fostering Connections Act. So in this slide, you can see the logistics of how to operate this webinar. First, please know that the slides from this webinar will be available on our website probably 2 hours following this webinar. The control features are shown here. There's an arrow that you can click on that will hide this communication box. So if you would like to hide that, just click on that arrow, and that should do the trick. And then importantly, please notice how to submit a question. There is a question box. It's very simple to just type in a question and hit send, and it will come through to the organizers. And we will try to keep a close eye on the questions coming in and answer as many as possible during the question and answer period. If your question is not answered, we will try to answer questions, and we'll be sending out responses in an email to all of the participants registered. So hopefully you'll receive a response today or in the near future. So as mentioned earlier, today marks the 2-year anniversary of the passage of Fostering Connections. The reforms included in this legislation cover many areas: adoption, kinship, education, health, services for tribal children, and of course, older youth provisions. There's a long history in Congress of child welfare legislation being enacted with broad bipartisan support, and Fostering Connections continued this pattern. Under the leadership of bipartisan sponsors in the Senate and House, the Fostering Connections Act was passed by Congress by unanimous consent just weeks before the presidential elections in 2008. There was diverse stakeholder support for the legislation. In fact, more than 500 organizations across the country supported final passage. A significant catalyst to final passage was the involvement of young people who very effectively shared their stories in congressional testimony and in correspondence and in visits with their representatives. And over the past 2 years, many of the organizations involved in the legislative effort have remained closely engaged in implementation efforts. In fact, the formation of the Fostering Connections Resource Center was the result of many of these non-governmental organizations wanting to have a clearinghouse of information and a gathering place for discussion. There is more information about the history of the law and the partnerships that comprise the Resource Center on the website. The website's there at fosteringconnections.org. So it's my pleasure now to introduce the speakers. On the first panel, Nina Williams-Mbenge is the Program Director for the Child Welfare Project at the National Conference of State Legislatures. She brings deep expertise in child welfare policy and has many years of working with state legislators and their staff. Following Nina, we'll hear from Representative Les Guerra of the House of Representatives in the state of Alaska. He sponsors House Bill 126, and as a former foster youth, he brings unique leadership to this effort. Following Representative Guerra will be Gail Gronert, a special assistant at the Office of the Assembly Speaker for the state of California. Ms. Gronert worked very closely with the authors of AB 12, Assemblywoman Bass and Assemblyman Bell. Next, we'll hear from Amy Lemley. She's the project director at the John Burton Foundation. The John Burton Foundation is an organizational co-sponsor of AB 12, and we look forward to hearing from her about the critical role that her organization played in the passage of AB 12. Following Amy, we'll hear from Barbara Langford. She's a consultant with the Finance Project and a national expert in child welfare. She has been leading the Finance Project's technical assistance work with states to conduct fiscal analyses of extending 4E eligibility to age 21. And Barbara will moderate the question and answer period following this panel discussion, and she also will introduce Celeste Bodner, who will lead the second portion. So Nina, turn it over to you.
Thank you very much.
And Nina, you have the mouse control.
I have control. Great. I will provide a very brief overview of state legislation that has been acted during the 2009 and 2010 sessions in response to the youth-related provisions of Fostering Connections. I'll cover the extending foster care to age 21 provision, the transitional planning provision, and the extension of guardianship and adoption subsidies beyond age 18. Yes, a few states have enacted legislation to extend foster care to age 21. In 2009, Texas extended foster care to age 22 at the request of the youth, and Washington State extended foster care up to age 21. And I provided all of the bill and chapter numbers on the slides. In 2010, a few more states took advantage of the provision. Alaska now allows foster care to age 21 and also allows emancipated youth to return to foster care. California just extended foster care to 21 and also allows re-entry into care. That Assembly Bill 12 legislation also requires the court to ensure that the child's transition plan is reviewed periodically and to ensure that the child has been informed of his or her right to terminate the dependency jurisdiction if they so want to. In 2010, Delaware also extended jurisdiction in foster care to age 21, and Tennessee now makes foster care services available to certain persons between age 18 and 21 who were in foster care upon their 18th birthday. In the transitional planning provisions in 2009, Arkansas required a transitional plan for youth no later than age 17 or within 90 days of a youth entering a foster care program for youth 17 or older. Illinois enacted the Foster Youth Successful Transition to Adulthood Act, which supplies essential kinds of supports and services to former foster youth under 21 who've been experiencing significant hardship upon their emancipation. Iowa also required transitional planning for youth age 16 or older in care to include the kinds of things, the kinds of planning that's here on the slide: health care coverage planning, access to mentors, education, and housing. In 2009, Minnesota required a transition plan for children 17 or older 90 days prior to discharge, and here again I've listed the types of programs and supports to be included in the transitional planning. New Mexico required a court review of the transition plan. The court must determine if the department has made reasonable efforts to have a complete transition plan for the youth. In 2010, a few states also enacted transitional planning legislation. Delaware required the family court to review the appropriateness of services provided to youth under their Chafee Independence Act. Georgia required the division to assist youth with a transition plan, again, and they listed the types of services and supports to be covered in the transition plan. And Vermont required transition planning to commence at least a year prior to a youth turning age 18. And finally, for the extension of guardianship and adoption subsidies beyond age 18, in 2009, the state of Michigan extended their adoption subsidy agreements to youth under 21, provided certain conditions are met. Those conditions include regularly attending high school or attending a program for children with disabilities. In 2009, Texas also extended adoption and permanency care assistance after age 18 and until age 21 or 22. This is based on available appropriations. And in 2010, California, also in the Assembly Bill 12, extended adoption and guardianship assistance to children under 21 who turned 16 before the adoption assistance became effective. Now, NCSL, we're tracking all of the legislation related to all of the provisions in Fostering Connections, and on the slide there will be a link to our website. We do provide all the legislation, links to the legislation on our website and other additional information. That's all I have on my slide. Next, I'm happy to introduce Representative Les Gara from the great state of Alaska.
Thank you, Nina. I appreciate it. In Alaska, we probably like in many other states. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Probably like in many other states, one of our major Achilles heels is transitioning youth into successful adulthood. And with the help of many people and with the standard, I think, set by Fostering Connections nationally, we were able to sort of capture the attention of the legislature here to say we're not doing very well in terms of transition. Roughly 40% of our youth coming out of foster care end up homeless at some point in their lives in Alaska based on a local study. So we were able to succeed, not easily, after 4 years of getting by many, many roadblocks, in passing a piece of legislation last year to extend foster care to age 21 based on the model of many other states, and with the input of some of the youth, and I have the head of Facing Foster Care Alaska, Amanda Mativier, with me. They also pointed out that our rule banning youth from coming back into foster care after they leave wasn't fair. So Alaska had a flat ban. If you left foster care, you were not allowed to come back, and we have changed that so that if you come back with a life plan and you work with the state child welfare agency, you can come back into foster care. So we're very encouraged by those things. Given the difficulty of getting legislation through, I'm going to try to move to the next slide. Given the difficulty of getting an actual bill through, and the bill that we got through was a fraction of what it started out as, we also were able to sort of use our negotiating power. The Democrats are in the minority in the House of Representatives in Alaska, but we're able to use our negotiating power and friendly folks on the other side of the aisle to put a number of things in the budget. So many of the reforms we got done in Alaska to transition youth to success came in terms of budget ads. Money to tell the states it's not okay to violate the spirit of federal law when it comes to youth moving between foster homes. They should not have to move between schools. And so we put money in for busing and transportation so youth don't keep bouncing between schools as they bounce between homes. Put money in to establish a mentorship program for youth coming out of foster care. Put money in to expand the college and vocational aid that's available to youth coming out of foster care. Right now it is not very much. Put money in so that we actually have some staff to administer the transitional program in the state. We only have 4 staff for the whole state to help transition youth into success in our independent living program. And so we've added 2 more staff, not enough, but more than what we had before. We have increased our efforts to recruit quality foster parents with an ad campaign. We have added some funds to the homelessness program, which provides rental assistance for youth who are on the verge of homelessness. And we, with Amanda and the state office, have also started a discount clothing program for foster youth. We do not have very much in the way of funding to buy clothing for foster youth, and now we have many stores statewide who volunteer to provide discount clothing to foster youth in a program we call Foster Wear that we started. So those are some of the reforms. We've put most of it in the budget because we couldn't get it through in terms of legislation. So it's going to be an ongoing battle here. I suppose that's my 3 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Representative Guerra. Next, we'll hear from Gail Gronert from the Office of the California Assembly Speaker.
Thank you so much, Nina, and congratulations to Representative Guerra in the state of Alaska for enacting what you were able to do. That's very exciting. And I have to say, we in California are still on cloud 9, having accomplished what we were able to do in AB 12 after a long and drawn-out process as well. So I feel like doing a virtual high five with everyone participating today because we are very excited. Let me say passage of this was a bright spot in the midst of a very difficult budget crisis, as you all know, and today actually is the day that the budget is finally coming to a close and we're commencing votes on our budget package. So it's 3 months late. It's been a difficult process for us here in the midst of a lot of philosophical disagreements about what to do over our budget crisis over the years. But let me say that I think what worked here was very similar to what worked on the federal level in that there was very strong bipartisan support to try and help the youth here in California who suffer through a lot of what Representative Guerra laid out in terms of outcomes that were happening to youth when they're forced to exit our system of care at age 18. And I want to first recognize a group that was instrumental in educating everyone and keeping this issue front and center for folks over the past years, and that's our advocacy group made up of current and former foster youth. It's called California Youth Connection, or CYC. The group is amazingly effective. They conduct conferences, workshops. They do a day of lobbying at the Capitol every year. They have chapters around the state. They meet with members in their districts as well as here in Sacramento. They work with the administration. They are incredibly eloquent and compelling in describing their issues, and I have to say they are chiefly responsible for, I think, engaging very critical legislators and groups in support of working on this legislation, which has been proposed every year for the last several years, and it was really kudos to those on the federal level who helped secure passage of the federal act. Now, after that was passed, we embarked on what I would say was a pretty intense campaign to try and lay the groundwork to enact AB 12, especially in midst of our very severe budget crisis. We have a very broad coalition of groups. We had 9 co-sponsors, ranging from our group home service providers, our children's attorneys who represent the kids in court. I want to give special recognition to the John Burton Foundation, and I know Emily Lemley will follow on the heels of this. They were active in the federal process and critical in our state process here. Our organization that supports social workers, our county organization, the courts, a host of advocates, we embarked on an intense 2-year process to lay the groundwork for the legislation. We turned to research and data to shore up not only why this needed to be accomplished, but I think in terms of our budget crisis to show where this would make a huge impact in savings in the future. And it was tremendously helpful that California already had a state-funded program to provide assistance to relative caregivers. The fact that Federal Fostering Connections included provisions to provide federal funds to help support relative caregivers actually created some state dollars that we could then turn around and plow into our youth program created by AB 12. So that was essential. I have to say an event that we did early on in our legislative process was a press event that included all 3 branches of government. We had the authors of the legislation, our Republican co-authors, who Danny Gilmore from the Fresno area, Nathan Fletcher from the San Diego area. They spoke at our press event along with our Democratic co-authors, principal authors of the bill. And in California also, our Supreme Court has established a Blue Ribbon Commission on foster care, looking at a wide range of issues around foster care, but focusing also principally on the needs of the youth. The Chief Justice's designee on the commission, Carlos Moreno, participated in our press event. We extended an invitation to the administration, the state administration, knowing that they did not yet have a position on legislation, but just to simply participate in an event that would simply highlight the issue. We did indeed have that participation and had a very successful event where at the end of the day the administration came out with a position of supporting the policy to extend supports to youth. So fast forward 2 years, we have gone through our legislative process. We took amendments to specifically say that the more expensive placements for youth would be very limited in focus, even though we think that that will not be a primary focus of where youth would choose to participate. We did take some amendments to narrow back some of the scale of the legislation, but at the end of the day, we benefited by the participation of the youth, as I said, all of our co-sponsors, and in addition, we had some highly visible sort of VIP support. We had our San Francisco 49er quarterback has a foundation supporting foster youth. He came to the state capitol, testified at a hearing. For our Foster Care Month celebrations in May, we had country singer Jimmy Wayne come out to help participate in our events honoring Foster Care Month, highlighting his efforts and his Meet Me Halfway walk across the country to highlight issues for foster youth. He's a former foster youth. At the end of the process, we also had peers from the Hollywood community who wanted to advocate with the governor, some of his peers who reached out to say, what can we do to help, and talked with the governor on the merits of supporting this kind of legislation. It was very effective. We had a piece in the Huffington Post by Rhea Perlman, wife of Danny DeVito, who has filmed videos in support of youth. I mean, really it was just an all-out campaign and contributions from many different groups and organizations across the spectrum that helped us tremendously with the legislation. I think everyone was very supportive of helping the youth who laid out their stories in such a compelling fashion, and it was a combination of efforts to try and see how we could reinvest our state savings, scale back some of our provisions in our legislation to ensure that we could succeed in having some things signed into law. So we're very, very excited about our work product finally. It really was a nail biter, I have to say, given all of our efforts with our very difficult budget debates hanging in the balance. And I think now today, hopefully, everything will come to a close. And we look forward to implementation and further work to help support our youth and our system. So how am I doing on my time? And I'm happy to turn it over to Amy Lemley.
That would be perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Gail. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the specific provisions of AB 12. Very briefly, I mean, it's a single-space 207-page bill, so we won't get that in-depth here, but wanted to give you a flavor of how California proceeded. And so I'm just going to go to the next slide here. I'm not sure if I have mouse control or not. Okay, thank you very much. So who is eligible for support to age 21 in California? And really we have 3 groups, and what I've done in parentheses after each group is give you a sense of what we're facing here in California in terms of numbers. We have about 5,000 youth who age out annually of our foster care or juvenile probation systems. So that's, by far the largest group who is eligible for support to age 21. But again, as was referenced earlier, we are also expanded support for young people who have exited to subsidized guardianships at age 16 or older, and young people who have exited to AAP at age 16 or older. Those are much smaller groups, but yet it was very much of a priority in California to not create a disincentive for permanency by offering one category of young people something that wasn't available to the other young people. So that is who we are very much looking forward to serving. At the bottom of the slide, you can see that the youth are subject to eligibility requirements, and those are the same 5 participation requirements that were laid out in Fostering Connections. So we don't expect, based on a variety of factors, for every young person to participate. Quite the opposite. But this is the number that we started with. So our next slide, please. So here's just a few aspects of our provision to extend support to age 21. AB 12 requires a juvenile court hearing or administrative review hearing every 6 months. So we do have active and regular juvenile court oversight. Our minimum child welfare oversight is a monthly contact with their child welfare worker. Many placements will be much more intensive than that, but that is something that will be provided to every young person. We do have a trial discharge provision, which we're very excited about implementing and wanting it to make it as accessible as possible for young people who do have a change in circumstance and are interested in re-entering care. AB 12 includes 2 new placement options that we're hoping can provide young adults with the opportunity for self-sufficiency and independence that will make this extension attractive to them. The first new placement option is called THP Plus Foster Care, and this is modeled after an existing program in California called THP Plus. Essentially, it's a supported housing program, and so what we've done is made that into a new placement option where young people can live in a variety of different housing settings where they can receive intensive, regular supportive services while at the same time the opportunity to develop and practice independent living skills. The second new placement option is the supervised independent living placement. And we've structured that in AB 12 very flexibly. We want to be able to meet young adults where they're at. And so under this placement option, a young person could be really almost in a self-identified placement. That placement would need to meet health and safety standards and be approved by the child welfare worker. And then under that new placement option, a young person would be eligible to actually receive a portion or their full foster care rate paid directly to them. So the kind of archetypical individual in this kind of placement is perhaps a young person living in a college dorm, having a normative, college experience. They would be able to benefit from this extension. They wouldn't have to live in a different kind of setting, but we'd be able to bring the benefit and the services and the support to them in a setting that that meets their needs and is appropriate based on their individual circumstances. The next bullet is just that. AB 12 is structured so that within all of the different placements, the full or a portion of the foster care rate may be paid directly to the youth. And then the last point I'll make is just that we do have a 3-year phased-in implementation. So essentially, AB 12 increases the age to age 19 on January 1st, 2012. Then it goes to 20, and then it goes to 21. So this is, I think, also an important part of what has made the bill viable in California. It's a very incremental implementation. It gives our system time to learn how to do this kind of practice. It also prevents a large increasing caseload suddenly. And so it's something certainly to think about, if you're from another state, and it was certainly, it also has, a nice effect of phasing in the costs. So the last slide I'm going to present is just a question that we get regularly about how financially this kind of penciled out. And Gail, basically summed it up very well, is the estimated cost of extending support to age 21 for these different groups was around $37 million, and that was including some current investment in our current transitional housing program. However, we had a very sizable state investment in our subsidized guardianship program. And thanks to the passage of Fostering Connections, we'll be able to supplant some of that state investment with newly available federal resources. So for us, because the bill that we moved on combined those two policies, the effect was for it to be cost neutral and potentially even a net savings. These, of course, are estimates. We will only know what the real effect is once the policy begins and we start to see how many young people participate, and we start to do that conversion process from our state-funded guardianship program into the federally funded one. But this is, I think, a very big key to the success of the bill is that we're able to combine those approaches and kind of offset the cost of extending with the savings of opting into the new federal subsidized guardianship program. So there's a lot more information. We have a website called CaliforniaFosteringConnections.org, and I realize I spelled it wrong there on that slide. There's a missing C. But if you go to that website, you can get a lot more information about the bill. And then we're also doing a web seminar on the 19th, and it's going to be really, not discussing implementation, more just really unpacking AB 12, talking about the provisions I've very briefly highlighted in more detail, and answering questions. So if anyone's interested in that, we'll make the registration for that available. And I guess the final thing I'll say before I'll turn it back is that we really want, at the John Burton Foundation, and I think I speak on behalf of all the sponsors and the legislators, feel a strong duty and commitment to making the information that we use in the passage of this bill available to other states, from our fiscal analysis to our political rhetoric, you name it. It has been a lot of effort, and while every state system is very different, we hope that by making this available, other states that are interested can use it and work in partnership with their state and county agencies to move the policy forward.
Great. Thank you very much. That detail is really interesting and really, really helpful from both states. Next up is Barbara Langford.
Great. Thanks, Nina. Okay, Barbara, you have the map. All right. Well, after the passage of the Fostering Connections Act, a common question in states was what's the actual cost of extending 4A eligibility past the age of 18? In partnership with the Jim Casey Youth Opportunities Initiative, the Finance Project developed a series of tools to help states first design foster care services for 18 to 21-year-olds, and then based on those design assumptions, project the net fiscal impact of extending eligibility. We've completed analyses in a number of states, and today I want to provide a brief update in a few select states, the state of Tennessee, who's now moving into implementation after passing legislation, and the states of Michigan and Iowa, who are nearing the end of their planning efforts and are preparing to move forward on a legislative front. To give folks a sense of the process by which, the process that we use to help states calculate the net fiscal impact of extending 4A eligibility, I wanted to highlight what those steps typically look like. First is determining the key design elements of extending care. What are your assumptions related to case management, placement options, judicial oversight, all of which have important cost implications. Certainly now states need to take a look at the cost of extending not only eligibility for foster care, but also for adoption assistance and guardianship assistance if the state has a guardianship program in place, with the new program instructions from ACF requiring that if a state extends eligibility for one 4E program, you need to extend eligibility across 4E programs. Secondly, after you've determined what those key design elements look like, to figure out what are potential sources of revenue to offset the costs. Those might be from existing state revenues, from Chafee funding that can be saved that's in particular being used for case management or placement support. Thirdly, to develop cost estimates based on the design assumptions, and finally to analyze the net fiscal impact of extending 4E eligibility based on all the puts and takes within that particular state. The Older Youth Network of the Fostering Connections Resource Center conducted 2 webinars earlier this spring and produced a series of tools and reports. So for more information on the process of conducting that type of fiscal analysis, you can go to the Older Youth page of the Resource Center for lots more resources on what the process looks like. I'd like to provide brief updates on our work in Tennessee, Michigan, and Iowa, all of which were Jim Casey Youth Opportunities Initiative sites, which importantly provided some critical foundation and capacity from which to launch to undertake these types of analyses. In Tennessee, a couple notable elements of the process to highlight. They had been a Jim Casey site since 2003. Legislation the previous session had created a new independent living oversight committee in 2009, which was a locus for really focusing attention on this issue. The Department of Children's Services, that independent living oversight committee, and the leaders of the Jim Casey Initiative convened a working group in the summer of 2009 with support from the Finance Project around the design and fiscal questions. They began an effort in August 2009, which concluded in the spring of 2010, positioned them then to propose and pass legislation, as Nina had mentioned, in the summer of 2010. Tennessee opted to use an incremental approach to implementation. The legislature approved $1.748 million for each year for the next 2 years to extend foster care. The Department of Children's Services selected an initial population of young people up to age 20 who are pursuing their secondary education. That was a population they felt was a manageable population given the resources available to support the expansion of services. The new appropriation enables DCS to expand services to an older population while at the same time being able to offset some mandatory cuts in its transitional living program. Tennessee has recently notified the ACF regional offices of this plan, and its updated 4E plan amendment is due to ACF by this December. So that was an exciting success in Tennessee and an example of a way in which that a state could incrementally implement an extension of care with a relatively modest investment on an annual basis. Another interesting state to highlight is the state of Michigan. Michigan really took a comprehensive approach to take a look at the supports and services that it was providing to older youth, using that larger context to consider the cost implications of extending 4E eligibility to 21. The State Department of Human Services is actually the Jim Casey Youth Opportunities Initiative grantee, and the other critical factor in the context in Michigan was in 2008 they were in the middle of negotiating a settlement agreement for a class action lawsuit at the same time that they were considering how to scale up and sustain their Jim Casey work. They undertook an intensive 9-month planning process to create a new service delivery model for older youth that was focused on a permanency teaming process, which also then included an analysis of extending 4E eligibility. As Nina mentioned, Michigan has extended adoption assistance to 21 in 2009. They're currently drafting policy language and working to pass legislation to extend their foster care maintenance program by year end. They're planning to submit their state plan amendments to ACF in January, and at this point in time are planning to extend 4E eligibility to 20 in 2011 and then to 21 in 2012. So again, an incremental approach to be able to get to the goal of going all the way up to 21. They're reconsidering their cost projections at this point in time in light of the recent program instructions, which detailed that for young people who leave care and reenter under a voluntary placement agreement, that states are allowed to make the determination of 4E eligibility not on the family of origin's income, but solely on the youth's income. That has critical implications for states to be able to assess the cost of extending 4E eligibility with a potentially much higher penetration rate. So potentially Michigan would be able to extend beyond 20 next year based on how their cost projections end up looking in light of those new program instructions. The final state I want to briefly highlight is Iowa, which the unique feature of the planning process in Iowa has been the engagement and leadership of the judiciary. The Children's Justice State Council, which is chaired by the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, actually extended leadership to develop a task force to consider the cost of extending care to 21 in early 2009. With support from the Finance Project around the design and fiscal questions, We began a fiscal analysis in summer of 2009, which was concluded in early 2010. Based on that initial process, the task force then created an intentional set of next steps to continue to build consensus around those key design issues and to lay the groundwork for a legislative effort. They formed 3 work groups which can continue to work over the summer: a design work group to revisit and reconsider the assumptions, to reach agreement on the final design features. Their design features importantly included payment of direct stipends to youth, which at the time that they chose to develop that recommendation, it was unclear from ACF if that would be an allowable feature. We know from the program instructions that is an allowable feature now, and is, as was in the case of California's design, an important piece of structuring the overall package of supports and services for transitioning youth. The Public Will Work Group was charged with identifying champions, developing talking points and engagement strategies, and the Policy Work Group was charged with reviewing needed policy changes and considering adjustments in their current independent living program. Iowa had their CFSR process this summer, which took a lot of time and attention. So they're refocusing their efforts this fall with the hope of being able to be prepared to introduce legislation later this year or early next year. A few lessons to highlight. Even if state leaders think that extending eligibility is off the table at the present time, this type of process and analysis allows folks to complete the necessary design work and to be prepared, to be ready to jump out of the gate when a better climate and new opportunities present themselves. The process can importantly also provide opportunities to consider supports and services beyond case management and placement, as several states did, to think more broadly about the total array of supports and services that are necessary for young people to effectively transition to adulthood, and that it's critical to be clear about and transparent about those assumptions and how projected costs are calculated. Different assumptions can obviously yield widely different costs. So looking forward to implementation, there's still much work needs to be done in states to create best practices for case management for 18 to 21-year-olds that recognizes and encourages the growing independence of young adults. A few critical questions remain for states and ACF to consider in terms of how states can take best advantage of the new provision that allows for redeterminations for young people who exit and return to care to be based solely on that young person's income. That certainly provides a much greater financial incentives for states to consider, but exiting and re-entering young people can potentially provide some disruptions in services. So trying to figure out how states can take best advantage while ensuring the best interest of the young person continues to be met, and how states continue to think about phasing in implementation, going to 20 and then going to 21 at a later point in time, and under what structures and processes those make sense. So for more information, I encourage you to take a look at additional resources that are posted on the Resource Center's webpage as well as the Finance Project's webpage. And we have do we have time for a couple of questions?
We do. We have just a few minutes.
Great, great. One question that participants posed, folks were interested in hearing what elements of AB 12 as well as the Alaska bill had to be scaled back in order to get it passed.
Go ahead, Representative Guerra.
Thank you. Yeah, this is Representative Guerra. Well, we were able to get extending foster care to 21 and allowing reentry of those who left in. We had substantial provisions requiring college scholarship money, college scholarship help, increased vocational education requirements. And we tried to put many sort of transitional things into the bill. Those had to come out. We had a couple hostile members who were not thrilled about the more expansive provisions, but happily we got what we did done.
Hi, this is Gail. For purposes of AB 12, I would say that Amy covered part of it. Part of it was indeed, we are assuming that states will experience a fiscal recovery, and that if we moved implementation out into the future. So ours begins January 2012, and then, as Amy said, it's phased in over 3 years. That helped the assessment of the potential difficulty for the state to absorb all at one time. As I mentioned earlier, we also took an amendment to specifically say that the more expensive settings could only be used in narrow circumstances. So, for example, if a youth is living in for example, a group home facility at age 18 and is still in the process of finishing high school, that youth should be able to stay in that placement if they choose to. It's you know, of course, this is with what the youth chooses to do, that they can do so, and then once high school is finished, that the youth would transition to another option. The other exception is that if the youth has such substantial difficulties that a group home type setting with more intensive services is what is appropriate, that placement is allowable, and the language provides that it's intended to be a shorter term stay with a transition to a more appropriate system of care. We also, given our current, we have another state-only program that Amy referred to, our transitional housing program, that we expend a certain amount of money on at this point, and the eligibility for that program extends to age 24. So now we will be able to access federal funds to help shore up our transitional housing program. But what we put specifically into statute was to say that our THP Plus program will remain funded within the fixed allocation that it's currently funded from. So we clarified and made clear on certain provisions that that's how we're going to move forward. The last piece is that the third and final year of phasing in implementation, again, as we said, we begin with 18-year-olds. A year later, we move to 19-year-olds. And then the third and final year, there is a built-in pause in implementation, and the legislature must enact an appropriation to help phase in that final year. I don't think that this will be a huge problem, and I think that we'll, again, have a very successful campaign to achieve that final year, but it is a nod towards our current difficulties and challenges. So those were really the major provisions that addressed concerns about the immediate financial situation. Let me just say we have not been able to cost out, and I think what would be very helpful is we of course all hope and believe that these statutes will reduce the homelessness that youth currently face and other kinds of very difficult outcomes that they face, and that in and of itself will generate long-term savings and a boon to the state. So being able to cost that out, which is very difficult, would be an enormous help.
We had one question around the population that care is being extended for in Tennessee. Actually, 20-year-olds who are pursuing secondary education, who are pursuing their high school diploma or GED, not post-secondary education. So I wanted to clarify that the population that care is being extended for in Tennessee are those 20-year-olds who are pursuing secondary education, their high school degree or a GED. One other question that arose was, what's the role of the courts in implementing fostering connections? How are folks in California and Alaska structuring the oversight of the courts for young people over the age of 18?
This is Les Guerra from Alaska. Actually, I think I don't have a great answer on that. We really haven't changed anything in terms of the court review process for transitioning youth. I was just talking about that with one of my staff members, but we haven't done anything in that regard. So flatly, we just allow foster care to remain till age 21, and we allow reentry to happen, but we haven't changed the court process at all.
This is Gail, and I would say in California it's similar, that we built on our existing framework but did, I think, recognize in some of the statutory language and criteria around various points in the court process that while we are assisting youth to transition, that they are legal adults, and so we did reflect that within some of the language we used around the court process.
Great, thank you. I can also share in Tennessee that they had in place in a regional area foster care review boards, citizen panels that were reviewing cases of older youth and then making recommendations back to the judiciary. And they proposed in their design recommendations to continue to utilize those foster care review boards, which tend to be a bit more youth-friendly than a formal court setting, to be able to continue to review cases and meet the judicial requirements. We have time for one more question, or should we move on?
I think we should move on to the next panel and hold on to the questions till the end.
Great,
Barbara.
Great. Thanks to the panel focused on state implementation. I'd like to turn the webinar over to Celeste Bodner for our second panel focused on the release of new transition planning tools. Celeste is the founder and Executive Director of Foster Club, the National Network for Young People in Foster Care, and will provide information on Foster Club's brand new transition planning toolkit, which helps states to effectively meet the transition planning requirements in an effective way. Celeste?
Thanks, Barbara. I'm pleased to introduce Foster Club's Transition Toolkit. It's a free resource that is available both on the Fostering Connections Resource Center's website and also on fosterclub.org. For those of you that aren't familiar with Foster Club is the national network for young people in foster care. We currently have over 30,000 members across the country. This particular transition toolkit that we'll be showing you today is based on extensive work that Foster Club has been doing on transition planning over the years. A lot of that was in partnership with the state of Oregon, where we're headquartered, but also in working with young people from across the country who are preparing to age out. Today we have two of our Foster Club 2010 All-Stars on the line who will present this tool. I'd like to introduce Ashley Jackson, who's a 22-year-old from Missouri. Ashley spent 5 years in foster care, and she's currently a senior at Missouri State University, majoring in public relations. And presenting along with her today will be Marcus Brown, a 21-year-old from Michigan. Marcus spent 5 years in foster care before being adopted at the age of 5. Marcus is currently a sophomore at Delta College studying social work. So Ashley and Marcus, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, can we get to the next slide, please? Okay, as you can see, the toolkit's design plays off a metro or subway map, helping young people think about transition planning as they would a map that would help them navigate a city. Each subway line correlates to a domain that should be planned for as a young person prepares for the journey to adulthood. When the Fostering Connections Act calls for the youth transition plan to address specific domains such as housing, health insurance, education, local opportunities for mentors, and workforce support and employment services, the young people of Foster Club have identified a few more comprehensive lists that the domain should be planned for. And as you can see here, the transition toolkit covers 10 domains. Those domains are housing, finances and money management, self-care and health, education, life skills, transportation, identity, permanence, community, culture and social life, and job and career. And out of the stops, one that I think is particularly important for youth is the stop of permanence, which identifies a permanent family-like relationship, supportive adults, and biological families. To me, it's especially important because a supportive adult can really help youth navigate through each of those stops. So that takes care of mapping out the transition.
Young people travel each line to discover what they should be planning for. Each color, such as the finance and money management is purple, is a subway line, and each line has several stops along the route. And each stop helps to build the youth's ability to better them or help them succeed in their transition out of foster care. And finance and money management is kind of important to me because I had the experience of doing a kind of just a little activity project, I guess, of what is wallet is what I like to call it. And it's where I went an entire week without my wallet, not knowing how I was going to cash my check, how I was going to buy food, how I was going to get around because I didn't have a bus card, I didn't have my library card. And it was an eye-opening experience for me. And I ended up stopping along the way to a lot of these and learning a lot more about checking accounts. How do I cash my check without having my official ID? I had to learn to budget with the little money that I could get. I had to build my management skills at the same time, and then also I ended up saving a lot more because I couldn't use my money.
And along with stops along the way are worksheets that are included. And as you can see here, these are some planning worksheets that help create a comprehensive transition plan. And these are also available with the transition toolkit that is free to use on fosterclub.com. And along with this worksheet, it helps the youth map out what they have, what they need, and what's their plan, and kind of just helps them get prepared along the way. And these worksheets are downloadable. And with each of them, you can kind of pick and choose what you want to do. A youth isn't required to fill out every single one. They can kind of do it as they go, and it kind of gives them like a guideline. Knowing what they have, they know what resources are available, and then can make a plan from there to fill out these plan worksheets.
In the toolkit, we acknowledge to young people that preparing for the transition to adulthood can be a little daunting. We encourage youth to get their very own GPS. To guide them through the process by pulling together a team of people, a transition team, we'll say. They'll have access to guides who have already made the journey to adulthood. These supportive adults can help show the way to equip themselves with information, advice, access to resources, and they can help you stay on track and will be by their side through this transition. We believe young people should determine who should be on their transition team, but encourage youth to consider foster parents or guardians, teachers and coaches, church members or pastors, along with caseworkers, CASAs, or anybody that seems important to them and is involved regularly in their case plan. At the bottom of each of the planning worksheets is a readiness scale. You and the team can rate how ready this youth is, a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not really ready at all, to 10 completely ready. Once you've completed a plan for all 10 domains, you can add up to all the scores to get a total score. By keeping track of your score, the transition team, which is the caseworkers, foster parents, judges, CASA, attorney, review board, mentor, etc., can measure the progress over time as they prepare the youth for transitioning.
And as I mentioned earlier, the Transition Toolkit is a free downloadable tool on fosterclub.com, but some additional resources that we offer on fosterclub.com are a state-by-state resource section, peer support, motivational stories, and other free tools like the Permanency Pack. And Marcus is going to share with you some of his favorite things that are available on fosterclub.com.
Some of my favorite things on fosterclub.com are, of course, the All-Star page. Because you get to see the experience that a lot of us All-Stars have gone through, as well as you get to see what different foster youth throughout the country are like by reading their blog and just learning about their experience. And my other favorite one is Fostered Famous, which highlights a lot of celebrities who are famous and were in foster care at one time, and it lets you know that no matter what your background was, it doesn't really dictate your future.
So thanks, Ashley and Marcus, for walking us through the toolkit. Again, that is available both on the Fostering Connections Resource Center's website and on fosterclub.com. Directly, we encourage people to connect to Foster Club, or better, to have your young people connect to Foster Club. There's lots of great stuff and great resources available on the website. I'd like now to turn it back over to Barbara from the Finance Project, who's going to talk about some companion tools that have been built to the Transition Toolkit.
Thanks, Celeste. The Transition Planning Toolkit is a fabulous set of tools for helping young people to identify the resources they need and to develop plans to address those needs to transition to adulthood. Its success is really predicated on having knowledge of and access to community resources, making sure that there's resources in the community that young people can draw on to support their transition. The Finance Project, in partnership with the Foster Care Work Group, the Fostering Connections Resource Center, and Foster Club, developed 2 companion tools to help engage community stakeholders in transition planning for older youth. These include a guide to mapping community assets for transitioning youth and an assessment of resources to support transitioning youth. They were designed and developed to fit hand in glove with the Transition Planning Toolkit and were authored by Kate Goggin, who's on staff at the Finance Project. The first guide is Mapping Community Assets. This guide helps community leaders to map what resources are available in a given community to support a young person's transition plan. So it's organized in the same format and the same structure within those 10 domains of the Transition Planning Toolkit, and once developed serves as the resource directory for older youth. So once they identify a need and a specific plan to put in place regarding one of those domains, this directory helps them then identify the community resources to help implement the plan. The guide includes tips on getting started, how to structure your data collection efforts, and guidance on how to create a data repository that can serve as an ongoing resource that you can update on a regular basis to ensure that there's a rich repository of information for young people to have access to during their transition planning process. The second guide focuses on assessing resources for transitioning youth. This is an assessment tool to help community leaders identify where they have adequate resources to meet the needs of transitioning youth and where they might need to strengthen supports and services. Helps folks to identify gaps at the community level, and it can serve as a basis for helping community leaders to prioritize and plan for additional supports and services. Again, it's organized with the same format as the toolkit, so you can easily translate that gap analysis into the context of the young person's transition plan. Both those tools are available on the Finance Project's website and will be available on the Fostering Connections Resource Center website as well.
Barbara, we do have about 3 to 5 minutes if there are any questions that came in for these panel members.
No, this is Celeste, and I know that one of the questions that came up was a question about any other organizations in the nation that are similar to CYC in California. And I would just like to say that actually there is, from CYC, there's been launched a national effort called National Foster Youth Action Network, led by Janet Knight, who I know has launched a chapter in partnership with Oregon, the Oregon Foster Youth Connection. And in addition to that, there are several really successful youth boards across the country. A couple that come to mind are Elevate out of Iowa and Youth in Progress in the state of New York. There are some very ambitious efforts going on in the state of Arkansas and actually in places across the country. And I'd encourage people, if they want to find a list of youth boards across the country, we do host a comprehensive list on fosterclub.com. And I think at this point we are ready to move to our next panel. So I'd like to introduce Daniel Heimpel, who is the creator and director of Fostering Media Connections. Daniel is an award-winning journalist who's written and produced stories for the Los Angeles Daily News, Newsweek, the Seattle Times, the Huffington Post, among others. But Daniel was introduced to foster care when he served as a volunteer coach for an unlikely lacrosse team in South Central Los Angeles. One of his favorite players was a 16-year-old named Chris who had some anger issues. Daniel asked Chris what his parents had to say about his misdirected rage, and Chris told him, "I don't have any parents. I live in a group home." From that point, Daniel became hooked on the cause, and now you could say Daniel is a journalist gone rogue. He's done a tremendous job at engaging the media as a lever to improve foster care. Daniel?
Hey, thank you, Celeste, and thank you, everybody who's out there. It's great to hear Amy Lemley's voice and Gail's voice and everybody else, you know, and also in celebration of AB 12 and the extension of foster care to age 21 in California. I was recently talking to a host of a radio station down in Southern California, and you know, the way I put it was unleashing a wave of positive change across the country, because I think that the message it sends is a pretty important one. But you know, in essence, for those of you who don't know what I'm doing, that bio kind of says what the reasons for starting what I've started. But basically, my idea was to speed the implementation of the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act by traveling from media market to media market, in which I would find those stories which spoke to the solutions inherent in the blueprint, which is the federal law. So that means stories on extension of care and what legislation is out there and how it links to the federal Fostering Connections to Success Act, whether it's educational stability issues, why are kids not getting the same kind of educational stability as their parented peers, and what are the solutions out there. And so the idea was to go from state to state and media market to media market and spend some time on the ground. I've got a cameraman that travels around with me, and we find all those stories, and then completely antithetical to what you would do if you are a normal PR guy or something trying to write the shortest press release you could ever write. I write out this huge menu of stories, which I then beat over the head of journalists and try to kind of remind them of their duty as citizens in the society and as the fourth estate to drive change, and to some degree that has rendered some small successes. I started in Washington State and then rumbled through California, Northern and Southern California, kind of two distinct media markets. I was just recently in Maryland, and next I go to Massachusetts. So I'm pushing forward and basically trying to recruit an army of journalists to one, kind of speed the implementation of the federal law, and two, change the old narrative into the more kind of accurate narrative. I was down in Los Angeles speaking with an editor for the LA Daily News, and he was saying, oh, well, which is something I hear all the time, was that the system is broken and you know, it's such dire disarray and all those things. And you know, I just pointed out that within the 10 years leading up to 2000 and to our current day, the numbers were soaring over 100,000 in California of youth in out-of-home care, and they're down to around 65,000 today. You know, a new PhD dissertation from a man named Joe Magruder up in UC Berkeley says he was tracking babies that entered foster care in 1999 through 2008, and it found that 4% of those kids were still in care 9 years on, which means that the narrative that we once had of children languishing in care is not per se the accurate narrative today. So that's kind of the secondary mission of what I'm trying to do, is to kind of change that overall perspective and perception, because I believe that will help bring in the outside, so the general public into advocating for the implementation of the law, because it's one piece to the puzzle, and then also letting these young people who are turning out to be, as Celeste was pointing out, and as the young people we're talking now are turning out to be leaders, and will hopefully be taking over Congress relatively soon and changing the whole narrative completely. But you know, in terms of that changing narrative, 2 weeks ago I was in Baltimore, and I went to a Voices for America's Children conference where all the advocates were pulled together, and Hope was I saw her name tag, but she wasn't there that day. But Brian Samuels, the head of the Administration of Children and Families, was. And as he was presenting, he said, you know, I want to talk to you guys about the changing narrative in foster care. And I thought that was pretty funny, because I'm running around trying to change the narrative of foster care. And he was very good by just pointing out some statistics. And I think that those statistics are good to remind us all why this is truly the most exciting story in the country, and why it's the most transformative issue that we have out there. And that is, in 1998, there were 560,000 youth in out-of-home care nationwide. By 2009, that number had dropped to 424,000. That's 136,000 less young people. The story of disproportionality, which was pervasive, has changed dramatically. In 1998, there were 240,000 African-American children in out-of-home care. In 2009, there were 127,000. That was 82% of the total reduction. Also, and in terms of adoptions, you know, while the perception that I run across is often one of barriers and difficulty with dealing with foster care administrations in getting children, the number of adoptions went up from 1998 from 37,000 in 2009 to 57,000. So what I'm trying to say here is that we have a completely new narrative to share with the general public, and to the degree that advocates and people who understand this stuff much better than I do, like all of you, can communicate the new narrative, I think that that's going to be critical to getting us to a place where we can drive the political will then to see these sweeping changes implemented. I mean, I worked very closely with Gail and Amy around AB 12, and I can tell you that taking their message then to journalists across the state, I found that then there was a great bit of momentum built. I mean, there was down at KPCC, this one producer was emailing me 2 nights ago saying that her story on AB 12 was the most commented on of the whole day, and that she can remember. And so what that says, there's a lot of interest out there, and it's a lot due to what you guys are doing. So it's a very exciting story to talk about, and it's something that I think that we can push forward on. Marcia? Oh, yeah, sorry. And I guess Marcy's telling me that we're ready for Q&A. So Celeste, I guess you'll handle that? Did I get cut off?
No,
Hello?
Sorry, I had myself on mute. Let's see. I know that there are several questions that have come in. One of the questions was around wondering whether or not how program availability was going to be communicated to youth, because often that's inconsistent, and as a result, youth are not aware or connected to available programs. I'd like to respond to that by saying Foster Club is partnering with several states. We do have state-by-state pages that allow young people to access resources. There are several states who have established their own resources websites. And I think young people, you have to meet them where they are, and the web is the place that young people are going to look for these kinds of resources. Our website receives upwards of 6,000 visitors per week. So young people are looking for these resources and are becoming more savvy. Also, I know an effective way of delivering information about these resources are youth conferences, which are sometimes difficult to do when budgets are tight, but it is a very effective way to educate young people about the resources available to them. I think Barbara or Amy, do you have other questions that you wanted to address?
Okay, it sounds like maybe there are no other questions. I don't know if Barbara had her phone on mute there. But if not, I'll transfer.
I wasn't quick enough off the dime to get my mute off. One question that came up is if states have the ability to restrict eligibility beyond the federal requirements for extending foster care past 18. And the answer is yes, with good reason. That the new program instructions that came out stated that states could, in fact, both extend eligibility to a younger age than 21, as well as restrict eligibility beyond the 4 categories that Fostering Connections specifies. But they had to be able to submit reasonable justification for their decision to do so. So that's a negotiation between a state and the regional office in ensuring that the more incremental extension is acceptable to ACF but the program instructions do allow a state to consider a more limited extension, not only in age but also in eligibility. A state would not be able to expand eligibility beyond the federal requirements. To do that, they'd have to do that solely with state funds. But a state could restrict eligibility, really a signal from ACF that they're trying to ensure to allow states the greatest amount of flexibility to be able to implement these provisions, to get started at some level if they're not able to implement fully, as a way to encourage states to take these options.
Well, this is Hope with the Resource Center, and I want to jump in at this point to thank all of our guests for their wonderful presentations. It was really an inspiring conversation today. It's not always that we can hear about such great progress all across the country, so thank you all for taking time. We know how busy it is, especially on the West Coast there. Those discussions about wrapping up the budget sound very, very important, so thank you so much for taking time today to be on this call. Thank you to the listeners. We know that you're interested in this topic. I think there are close to 400 people on the webinar today. We will post these slides as quickly as possible by the end of this afternoon, and very shortly we'll have the audio available as well so that you can watch it with your colleagues. You can see the Resource Center's website right there. Many of the resources discussed today are already available or will be posted shortly. Please notice that there is an upcoming webinar on October 21st. It'll be in the evening, and it's a peer-to-peer training on the transition toolkit that Foster Club presented today. We also have a discussion forum. We welcome you to join that. You have to be a LinkedIn registrant, so please do join that. It's a wonderful way to converse about these topics on an ongoing basis. So again, thank you all for joining, and thank you for your questions. We'll do our best to answer those and send those back out. Good afternoon.